Hey, what is going on, guys? In today's video, I have seen all of your requests to do a controller sensitivity guide, and it is coming right now. We're going to go over the sensitivity settings, the specific settings to controllers such as edit mode, aim assist, as well as the binds, but we will be mainly focusing on sensitivity because there have been two major buffs to controller. One, L2 aim assist back to the way it was before, meaning if you want to repeatedly spam L2 over and over again, there will be no cooldown. And two, there's also an edit mode sensitivity multiplier, meaning that it can be decoupled for your build sets and you have more flexibility over how you set that up. Let's start out with your base sensitivity. Base sensitivity is honestly down to preference. I've seen people go low, like 0.6 or higher, 0.8. It just really depends on how you want to play. One thing to keep in mind though is if you want to use L2, a lot of the times you're going to be aiming with the hip fire sensitivity. So if you set it too high, it may become very hard to use L2 effectively. So that is something to think about. Like going above 0.75 would try to L2 like that is going to become difficult. For me, I've had it at 0.7 for going on many years now. At this point, I'm so locked into this sensitivity, I don't think I would really change it. I think 0.7 is a decent compromise between being able to L2 effectively at range while still being able to move your crosshair around in hip fire shotgun fights. But this is really a preference setting. It's just really dependent on how you like to play. I wouldn't say that's like a hard rule, you must be at 0.65 to 0.75. I don't think that's really true, but just consider if you want to L2, be careful about going too high. Now, targeting sensitivity is one of the most interesting settings that I've seen for controller. There's really a major divergence between the two ways you can play controller. The first way is playing it the conventional way. You're not using L2 spam. When you're aiming, you're just holding ADS and you're aiming, just holding L2 instead of spamming L2 like you would if you want to aggressively use aim assist. And what I noticed with this setting is that people that don't L2 aggressively, think like Yino and Resi, run their targeting sets very low, like in the 0.3, 0.4 range. And that's because that allows you to aim at incredibly long range and still be accurate. Even when aim assist stops working, you can still be pretty accurate if your ADS sense is low. And since you're not L2 spamming, when you're aiming down sights, you're solely using this sensitivity. So it doesn't matter if there's a major delta between your base sense and your ADS sense. However, people like me and Fusion will run much higher ADS sensitivity. And why would that be? We do that because if you are L2ing aggressively at close range, you're spamming L2 in and out, what's going to happen is that you're alternating between base, targeting, upwards of 5 times a second, you are alternating between those two sensitivities. If you set your targeting sensitivity really low, what's going to happen is that's going to make aiming very awkward because your sensitivity is going to be changing by such a huge amount multiple times a second. It's going to be very hard to reliably aim. So therefore, you'd want to set your targeting sensitivity higher so it's more similar to your base and you can aim very effectively at close or medium range. The compromise of this is that at extreme ranges, when aim assist stops working altogether, it will be borderline impossible to aim with a targeting sensitivity this high. So it's something to consider that you have to decide what playstyle you want to adopt. Do you want to play a more conventional playstyle, more mechanically driven playstyle, where you want to lower your targeting sensitivity? Or do you want to play a playstyle more focused around aiming, and you run a higher targeting sensitivity and use L2 aim assist aggressively? That's really a preference thing. I'd like to make a video on this specifically, because I think it's an interesting thing to point out. But you just have to decide which playstyle you want to adopt, or maybe you go in the middle. Maybe you go like 0.55 and kind of do a bit of both. It's really up to you, but just think about what philosophy you want to adopt. Scope sensitivity, I run it at 0.60. Honestly, I don't use snipers that much, so I run it a bit lower than my targeting sensitivity. Obviously, scopes, you don't want it at 1.0, you want it lower than that, obviously, because you want some slowdown. But scope sensitivity, because you're not really using L2 with scopes, this is more down to preference over how you like to use it. Now, building and editing sensitivity, there are really two general rules I'd recommend. One, you want both of these above 1.0, obviously, because you're going to want to have your building sets and editing sets higher than your base sets, since those two require less precision than aiming. And the second thing is, I generally recommend your build sensitivity is higher than your edit mode sensitivity, because building will generally require less precision than editing. As you're moving across, think of building as like placing 3x3 tiles, while editing you're only doing 1x1, right? So you're probably going to want to higher, but this depends a lot on your ping, how you build, It's honestly preference. Just if you follow those 2 rules and you kind of get it to how you like it, I think you're going to be fine. There's not a hard set rule of where you set this. And also remember that all these multipliers are based on your base sensitivity. So if your base sensitivity is lower, to have an equivalent build sensitivity, you need a higher multiplier. So just something to think about. Okay, in terms of your control options here, there's just a couple I want to point out. Edit mode aim assist. I think edit mode aim assist can be helpful when you're new, but as you get better at the game, when you edit stairs, you're gonna have problems with trying to get your crosshair over that middle block that like isn't an edit piece, if you know what I mean. It's very hard to get your crosshair to push over that. So I actually recommend having this off once you get more experience, because it's just gonna end up reducing the amount of times you get tripped up. And the second thing, build a pro build immediately. You must have this on. Must. This is not a preference thing. This is a mandatory setting to have on. Otherwise, every time you switch pieces, you have to double click, double click, double click, double click. And that's going to be inherently slow versus just single clicking with build a pro build immediately to place builds. So this is a mandatory setting you need to have on. Also, as you're covering the binds, this setting, controller edit time, should be irrelevant because you should have an instant edit button. Okay, let's move on to your controller binds. Binds are very much preference because there's 3 general ways you can set up how to play controller. You can play conventional, where you put your key binds like pickaxe, edit, switch mode, reload. All these are on your XY buttons, your ABXY buttons, or for PlayStation, it's circle, square, X, triangle. You can play claw, where you use your second finger to press these buttons so you don't have to take your thumb off the right stick. Or you can play paddles like I do, where you bind all those buttons to paddles and you put them, for me, I put them on D-pad. And the reason why I do that is because that frees up these buttons to place the secondary buttons like map and inventory, and these are easier to hit than the D-pad for me. This is really going to depend on how you set up your controller, but there are a couple key things that everybody should be doing no matter which configuration you decide to use. First off, you need a dedicated edit button. If you are using switch mode / edit, that is inherently terrible, because if you're using that, you're going to be forcing yourself to hold the button every time you want to edit. And that is not a good idea because you're just slowing yourself down. Having an instant edit button is essentially a mandatory setting, and you need to have this. Number 2, crouch. I highly recommend you switch crouch / pair to crouch. The reason why is because if you have crouch / pair, when you press the crouch button, you're not going to crouch. It's going to crouch on release because the game has to check whether you're pressing the button or holding the button. And if you don't have that, if you only have crouch, what that's going to mean is as soon as you press the button, you're going to crouch. So you're just making the crouch button inherently more responsive. Those are your build settings. A couple things to keep in mind. Same rules here. Make sure you only have crouch and not crouch / pair. The game is going to try and bind stuff like emotes and squad comms in build mode. Just unbind those in build mode. Because if you really need to emote, just go back to regular mode. By putting these binds in build mode, all you're doing is just making it more likely you press the incorrect button and open things you don't need. Same thing for like inventory and map. You don't need these buttons in build mode. Just unbind them. It's fine if you have unbound buttons. It's just reducing the chance you make a mistake. In terms of your edit binds, same rules apply. Make sure you have crouch. I think also in build and edit mode, it's going to try and rebind this to rotate instead of crouch. Just unbind rotate. Rotate is honestly the most useless thing. I have found 0 scenarios where you need to use rotate. You can just waterfall. And I'd also recommend moving the reset button. You know, I can't remember the default bind. I think it's down on right stick. That's not inherently terrible, but again, you're making it impossible for yourself to crouch. So I'd recommend maybe trying left trigger or maybe the bumpers for reset. That should overall help you. And again, the game is going to try and bind squad comms and all this garbage. Don't bind it. It's just not gonna be useful, and you're just making more chances for you to mess up. Finally, for your dead zones, I try to set them as low as possible without having stick drift. I think that's a good rule of thumb. If you don't know what dead zones you should try, what I'd recommend you do is lower them to the minimum, and then see if you have stick drift. If you have stick drift, slowly raise it up by 0.01 until you find where you don't have stick drift. This is going to depend a lot on your controller. Some controllers, a brand new controller, you might be able to set it to the minimum. But on a really old controller, you might need a higher dead zone. It just really depends on what your controller's stick drift is. Some people like putting it lower so it's more responsive, but having stick drift, I don't necessarily recommend that because that means when you're walking around, your stick is just going to be moving your view around when you're not putting input. I don't think that's a good idea. So overall, I'd recommend using that method. But again, stick drift or dead zone is really personal preference, so you just have to find what setting works for you. And with that, I hope this helps you, and I'll catch you in the next video.